Hello patrons and welcome to a new video editing tutorial. This one is slightly different. When I recorded this tutorial, I wasn't too sure if I was going to post it. Just because it's slightly different, it's a bit more of a workshop slash me kind of experimenting around as I'm kind of talking about my thought process, and it's all to do with texts and headlines and creating title graphics. Not necessarily title graphics with animations, but just titles in general, and making them look aesthetically pleasing. I know that a few of you have asked me about this, and I wasn't too sure how to properly do a tutorial on it. And so when I launched into it, it became more of me workshopping ideas and kind of playing around with things as I commentate about my thought process. That might actually prove to be more helpful than a normal standard tutorial, and that's the kind of the reason why I ended up keeping it and why we're going to use it, because I think it is also helpful. I'm trying to think how it might be on someone else's end. It's useful to hear about how someone else is going about that process in their head and changing different ways and in which the text might look. Yeah, in general, I think it was a very helpful tutorial in hindsight, which is why it may be a little different, but do let me know what you think. Essentially, we're going to be going over titles, as I said, headlines, how to make them look nice, etc, etc. It's going to be interesting. Do let me know, give me your feedback, but I hope you enjoy. Okay, so we are in an After Effects composition at the moment. This is going to act as our canvas, our workspace for this tutorial, where we're going to experiment around with a couple of ideas and really show you what I'm talking about when it comes to making your title graphics or just your titles in general look good. So that's the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to get into our type tool. I'm going to click that, and let's just head in and write, for example, let's just put in headline, right? So let's say we're going to make a headline. Now, I've got a text or a font here. The font is probably the first thing that you're always going to notice about, a text or title that you're going to be using. And the font is the main thing that first you're going to have to deal with. So I've pulled up a random font here. This was Simsun. There's plenty of random fonts that you can use, but the first mistake that people will make is using a font that just doesn't look good, or it doesn't look nice for like a headline or like for a cinematic look or something that looks nice and professional. Of course, it depends on what you're going with. Some fonts look a bit more amateurish, and they'll probably be better for a video that's targeted to a younger audience versus one for like more of a professional audience, or if you're trying to go for more of a cinematic tone. So let's just use this Simsun font as an example. The first thing that I want you to notice is it really doesn't look good, is the main thing to note. Now, it's hard to even emphasize what it is about it that just doesn't look nice. It almost just feels like a very underwhelming like font for a headline. The first thing you can always do, right, that we notice with a headline, the first thing that you can always do is just capitalize each letter, because it's a headline. You want it to be bold, you want people to see it. So yeah, pretty obvious reasons why capitalizing a headline will probably look better than having it like this, where you have like the lowercase letters and then you just have the capital letter at the start. So instead of having to rewrite this entire headline text again, one thing that you can do is head over to your character window over here, and you should see this icon, which is all caps. If you click that, there you go. It looks somewhat better. It has a bit more of that feeling that you want to get from a headline, which is it's more impactful. You actually notice it. It's hard almost to define this, but you can probably tell what I mean by looking at it yourself. That being said, it's still not great. We're kind of dealing with a bad font in the first place here. But before we tackle the font, I'm just going to show you some ways in which you can still improve something, even if you're using something like a bad font. So the next thing that I want to do here is I may want to make this thicker. Sometimes headlines might work with a thinner font. That definitely is the case. But I think in this case, let's have a test and see if we can make this headline thicker. There's two ways you can go about doing this. The first way is under the font that you've got here. You've got a little drop down menu over here to select what font you're using. Below that, you will have a font style window here, which you can just click the drop down arrow and you can go into the font style, and normally or sometimes you'll find a list of styles of fonts. You can have regular, you can have thin, sometimes you'll have bold, and they can go all the way up. And what they'll do is they'll generally deal with the thickness of this text, because as you can see, this is a pretty thin text. We don't have that. On this Simsun font, we don't have this bold font style, or we don't even have a thin one, we just have regular. So we're kind of operating, again, this is pretty limited means that we have to operate and change this title around, but what we can do is we've got an icon over here which is called Forks Bold, and if you just hit that, it makes it a little more thicker. So again, this font is terrible, it really doesn't look good, but that achieves the purpose of kind of making it bolder. I would argue that potentially the thinner headline works better here. And of course, this is something that you have to experiment with titles over time. You just have to see which one will look better. And in my opinion, I actually think the thinner headline looks better, but that's okay. We'll keep it thin. The next thing that you can do, however, let's pretend it's bold around the text, and let's assume that this isn't good enough and we need it to be even more thicker. So ideally, you'd have a font that is already thick, but if you're really struggling, you can head over to this little thing over here, which is selecting the stroke width for the font. And I'll show you what happens if we just click here, and I'm holding Control and then dragging to the right to slowly increase this. You can see what's kind of happening with the text. So what it's essentially doing is it's adding a stroke around our font that we have, and the stroke color will depend on what we've selected over here as our color. So if, for example, we wanted the stroke to be something other than black, you would change, it's not this first color over here, it's actually the second color. Actually, if you hover your cursor over it, it will tell you it's the stroke color. It's the one just behind here. It might be a little hard to see. If we double click that, and you would get this window which pops up. It just popped up on my second one here, but I've dragged in here, and you can select any color that you want, and you can see what that's actually doing. So I'm obviously going to select black, because if you're trying to make the text bolder, you're going to want the color to be the same as the actual text, but it's just important to know what this is actually doing. In fact, if you did want to include a stroke like we've done here, you can do that, and this is how you can do it. But in the case of just making the text bolder than what we're allowed to, we can literally just make the stroke color the exact same color as our actual title, and then we can choose how thick we want that stroke to be using this slider here, which actually leads us on to the next thing that you can use to make your headlines look good. Because as you notice, when we increase the stroke size of this font, the stroke ends up like mixing with all the other letters, and it just looks like horrible right now. So what we essentially want to do, and what we normally have with headlines, and what I normally do with headlines, is we want to increase the space between each letter. And there's this magical thing that you can use. Again, we're going to highlight this text, and over here in our character window, you've got this tracking option. So I'm going to click, hold Control, I'm going to drag to the right. Let's see, I'm not going to hold Control because it limits us too much here, and we want to actually be able to see what we're doing. And you can see as I drag this thing further and further away, it will create more space between each of the letters. So this is obviously way too thick for a stroke for our headline. So I'm going to obviously drag this down and make it somewhat reasonable, something like that. There we go, and I'm actually going to decrease the tracking a little bit here. And there we have something that looks a little more reasonable. This isn't all we can do to make a headline look better, but we're kind of, again, we've limited ourselves with not the best font. At least I'm trying to imagine we're going to create something that's more professional, more cinematic, something more that I would use in my own videos. So let's change the font. And there's a few fonts that are more cinematic in nature. You kind of have to go and cycle through a few of them to see which ones pop out the most to you. There's also really good articles you can probably search online for just cinematic fonts on Adobe, but I'll give you one that I use quite a lot, or I really enjoy using, which is Roboto. I'm pretty sure this is, you can just activate this font if you have the Creative Cloud on Adobe. And let's go and select, let's go for Roboto Regular. And that is a much better font. If we're going for something which is like more cinematic in nature, like this is far better. This is bolder, it's clearer, it just looks more professional. And as you can see, we've already made it like quite thick. We've added in the tracking over here. And there's a few things that we can do. So I might even make it less thick. See what we can do. In fact, I'll drop the stroke width. I'll drop to 0. That's your last solution to making the text font thicker. The first thing that you may want to do is just look into the actual, and you'll see now in our font styles drop down menu here, you'll see that we actually have a bunch of options. So we can go to bold, and that actually looks really good. I'm happy with that. Let's see what else we got here. So black obviously makes it even thicker, and then the thickest we can get it, yeah, is actually black. So black italic just literally turns the text into an italic like that, but we'll talk more about that in a bit. So here we have headline. This looks nice. This looks more cleaner, more simpler if this was going to be a headline. So let's talk maybe what if we then had a subtitle next to this. When you create like a subtitle that goes, let's say, below this, you don't want it to look too much like the headline. You want to have it vary in some way or another, and I'll show you like different ways in which you can get a subtitle to be different than your headline, or make it just pop out a little bit differently. So what you don't want is something like this. So let's say this was a travel video, and let's say we've got a shot of Paris and we wanted some text to come up, and the headline will be France, and the subtitle, let's make a new text layer here, the subtitle will be Paris, and let's not make it italic. Let's, again, the same as our headline. You don't want a situation where you've got the headline, the subtitle basically looking very much like the headline. They both pop out. It almost feels like you've just got two headlines here. So the most obvious way to differentiate this subtitle from the headline is just through the font size. So let's reduce this font size, and we can make it smaller. So that's the first way we can make it pop out. So now there's like a clear sense of, okay, this is the headline. You read that first, it stands out the most, and then Paris is the second thing here that comes out. Pretty good. And this could probably work. It really depends on what you're looking to achieve. This could work as a headline and a subtitle. That would definitely work. Or there's a few other ways. So we've already reduced the size. What we can also do is change the thickness of this text. So what I can do now is I can make it light, and there you have it. And that looks even better in my opinion. There's a far more clearer difference between this bold headline and then our subtitle over here. Let's think some other ways in which you could do this. You can maybe decrease the tracking. Let's say we had more of a tracking here, and then maybe we decrease the tracking over here so it's closer together. You can try something like this. I actually don't think that looks any bit different really. It's a small thing. It might work in different situations. So I'm going to Control Z all of that, get it back to what we had. Another thing you can do, a really obvious one, is to make the subtitle an italic. So what you can do is either you can go from light, you can, in the font style drop down menu, you can go and click light italic. But if your font doesn't have this, you can literally over here click this forks italic icon, and it does it like that. And that's another way in which you can differentiate that subtitle from this headline. You can change up the position as well. You don't always have to have the subtitle there. You can have it over to the left, or maybe you can have it, let's Control Z that. So maybe you can have it dragged up over here. You can have it on this side. You can have it over here. You can even be a bit creative and have it somewhere like that. Yeah, that could work as well. You can even let's say rotate this. So we got here on our Paris layer, we can rotate this by, say, 90 degrees it should be. Let's make that minus, actually yeah, 90 degrees is fine. And then we can move it here, and we'll remove the italic. I'll drop the text like that. Actually, we'll increase that text size. So I mean, you could do something like this, even though that's like literally almost impossible to read. But again, this gives you an idea of like how you can experiment around with these settings that you have to create titles that look really interesting, or like you separate a headline versus a subtitle. Another thing that you can do, there is a website that exists that kind of helps you with this. It's called Font Pair. I've pulled it up on my second monitor here, and I'll drag it in so that you can see. So we've got font pair over here. This is the name of the website, and what it allows you to do is you can literally search for a font, and I've searched for Roboto, which is the font that we're using, and it literally tells you the fonts that go well with Roboto. So the first font that it displays here, this Domine, however, I don't know how you pronounce that, but whatever it is, this and Roboto. So Domine is the headline, and Roboto is all of this paragraph text that is being used. It tells you here, heading is Domine and body. They call this, yes, the body is what you call this text here. This would be Roboto. So let's find one where Roboto is actually the title. We've got Roboto slab. Do we just have, okay, so we've got Roboto and Nonito. Nonito is the body text here. So let's imagine, okay, so we've got France, we've got Paris. So what we can do, imagine if now we want to write a paragraph about France, and we're just going to write in a bunch of, you know, random, completely random stuff. Here's what I'm going to do to change this a little bit. Let's deselect all caps because we don't want that. This is actually the body of the text, so we can include, you know, capitals, lowercases, etc, etc. So I'm just gonna spam a bunch of words here. What you'll notice is I've pressed enter to go into a new line, and now the text for some reason is appearing on top of this line. The reason that's happened is it's because we haven't selected a distance. I've accidentally put 0 here for the distance between the sentences. So if I can just hit Control A to select all of this, and I'm just gonna increase this thing over here, so you can actually see now we're creating distance between our sentences. Okay, so that looks better. I'm just going to continue writing a bunch of gibberish. Okay, let's imagine I've just written a paragraph about France here, okay? Well, that's not complete gibberish. And now we know from font pair that a font style that works really well when you're trying to create the body of a certain text is Nonito. That was the name. So Nonito, let's search it up here. We've got Nonito Extra Light and Nonito Bold. So we're kind of limited in our font styles, but let's click on Extra Light. Let's see what this looks like. So that is Nonito. Let's say we want to make this a little bit thicker. So remember, if we don't have that option over here, well, we've got one which is bold. That's actually pretty thick. Let's look at the difference between Nonito Light, but instead of choosing the bold font style, we're going to choose the Forks Bold that we got here. Yeah, and that's a little better. It's not as thin as we have over here, even though that looks pretty good, but it's also not as bold as we can choose in the font style. So it's a little bit of the in-between if we use the Forks Bold. Okay, so that would look pretty interesting, I think, as like the body text. This is maybe a paragraph about France, let's say. In fact, I did actually just pull up like an image of just something in nature to see what that might look like. As you can probably see, this text would have to be a different color, or we'd have to have some way of distinguishing this from our background. So we can experiment with that, actually. So if you are facing a situation where your text just doesn't look good on whatever your backdrop is, what you can do is let's select our body text layer. Let's actually go into our effects and presets here once we've selected this body layer, and what we'll do is we'll select the drop shadow, and I'm just going to click and drag that in. So this is one way you can try, and it's no guarantee, but it might help. So drop shadow will then drag the distance to 0, and then we'll increase the softness. It's still not good enough, so that's the first thing that you can try, but it just doesn't do enough to make it distinguish or stand out a little. So another thing we can try is actually setting up some kind of shape layer behind this body text. So let me actually zoom out over here and just adjust this so that it looks good, or at least fits the body text. Even now it's really hard to see. And this can happen quite a few times. Sometimes like you'll just have to experiment even with the font color is another way of helping you with this issue. But let's see. Okay, I think that should be fine. I'll move this underneath the body layer so you can actually see. Okay. Let's drag that up like that. Cool. So one thing you can do is we've created this, you know, basically this rectangle shape. We can then drag that opacity down a little bit so that it just looks a little nicer. It's not as, you know, like when it's at 100 opacity, this is just way too, it's too much. It looks a little more professional if you just drag the opacity down. It allows you to actually see that body text a little better. Again, this isn't maybe the most ideal situation. You may want to change like font colors, or you may want the background to be a little bit different. But yeah, this is an option. If you are struggling with the background just is not working at all, you can do this. And remember as well, body text normally has really thin font, which kind of makes the situation even more difficult. Let's see what this would look like. Yeah, if you had bolder text, and let's say let's just hide this layer. I mean, it's still pretty difficult to tell from the background. And you can also experiment with text color here. If I'm going to head on to, let's see, selecting that all, and let's just head on to our white text color. See if that changes anything. The problem that I've done here is I've selected the stroke color over here, which is this sort of rectangle with the hole in the middle. You want to make sure that you've got the correct things. You want to make sure you've selected the fill color instead. So we've got fill color, and now we've made that white. So white stands out much more on the background that this text is on, the body text is on. Yeah, so I guess it's decent. You can sometimes even decrease the opacity of the image itself if we did that. And what I'll do is I'll make a solid layer which goes right down here, so that when we drop the opacity of nature, it's a little more darker background. Something like that. Yeah, so there's a various ways in which you can get something, a particular kind of text to stand out in a background if it's really difficult. The ideal solution is just to not have too much of a complicated background, or to create the shape layer that will go like underneath a body text, and of course the color of that shape will have to correspond. So if it's going to be a white shape, then you're going to want black text, of course. Okay, so let's actually experiment with something else here. Again, like the point of this tutorial is really just to show you a bunch of ways in which you can create like interesting titles. And one thing that you can do, I'm going to just delete all of that background and body text, but one thing you can do to make titles a little more interesting is you can add a texture onto some of these. So I'll explain to you what I mean. So right now this is basically a straight up black text with France in it. There's no texture to it. You don't see like holes or marks or anything like that. But you sometimes might see this in different title graphics, especially in like cinematic stuff. You'll see that sometimes the text has like, it's really hard to describe. It's almost like a metallic texture. You might see there's a whole range of things, but I'll show you what I mean, or how to actually achieve that. So I've pulled up a texture image over here, and that is this thing, and it looks like kind of almost like a chalkboard, but a very metallic one with a bunch of scratches in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change the track map, and what we want here, and I'll show you what I mean. It's very almost hard to describe what a track map is and what it does, but it's very easy to like see it for yourself and understand what it does. So what I'm going to do is we've got our texture JPEG over here, and here we're going to just create on our track map, and we're going to make alpha. We're going to select alpha matte and France. Now, what this is alluding to is this layer above it. You want to make sure that whatever you're trying to make the alpha is above the actual image that you're using. That makes sense. I'll show you what I mean. So here's texture.jpg. We're going to make that alpha. We're going to make the alpha the France text. So as you can see, what we've done is we've essentially, and you can notice it over here, is if it's hidden away our actual text layer here, because if we bring it back, you'll see what it is, which is just our normal text layer. But what selecting the track map for France to be the alpha for the texture JPEG is it puts all of that metallic stuff inside just what we've made the alpha. So it's, as you can see, that texture JPEG is now all inside that France text that we had. And you notice if I've got the texture.jpg selected and I start clicking and moving around, you'll see how that metallic texture is in there. And it's like moving around as I move the mouse. But of course, as you notice, just ignoring that any of that has happened, you'll see that now our France text has a nice texture to it. So what you'll notice is that France text has a nice texture to it. And you can really do a bunch of things with this. You can change around like the textures that you can find online. The way in which I found this texture was literally Google imaging texture. And then I found like one that I thought would look interesting, downloaded that, and here we have it. What's important to note, what's helpful, is once you've actually made a certain font with a texture, you just want to select both of those. You want to select both the image of the texture and the text itself, and then you may want to pre-compose it. So over here, let's put France texture text. And the reason we want to pre-comp it is just so that we all have it in one go. We don't have to worry about there being two separate layers here. And you can add a drop shadow as well. So by the way, if you are curious as to, because sometimes you'll see me kind of click on a layer and I'll open up this menu and I'll search for an effect like this. This is just FX Console. It's a really useful plugin on After Effects. I'll probably have to do a tutorial at some point talking about different plugins that I use, but this is probably the main one that you're always going to have to use when you're on After Effects. Or you can just go to Effects and Presets if you don't have it, and then just select drop shadow in there. It's a free plugin as well, by the way, so it's like well worth getting it. So I've dragged in drop shadow. This is an interesting thing that you can sometimes do with text. This looks interesting. If you wanted to have this effect where it's a very obvious shadow, if you wanted to make it more softer, we can do that. If you wanted to decrease the distance so that it's closer to here, and then increase the softness so it looks like it's like radiating from the text, that's an interesting way of making that text stand out. Let's see. You can do something like this where you increase the distance, wherever you want it to be. Or decrease that softness. You can even increase the opacity as well if you want that shadow to be really noticeable, just like this. There's a couple things like you can mess around with always when it comes to fonts like this. There's also like sometimes I might even add a roughen edges to text. So going to put in a roughen edges here, and you can see it kind of, well, it does what it says, it roughens out the edges, and then you can play around with these settings here depending on what you're really trying to go for. But this is like a almost ruggedy, strange look, but it's interesting. Like, it will work depending on the context. Just experiment around with all of these settings. They do various different things. You can also change the edge type from roughen to like spiky. Photoshop does this like interesting thing where it almost like fades away some of the inside. Let's see. Photoshop color allows you to actually choose what color you want it to fade away to. I mean, this doesn't look great at all, but under certain contexts it would look really nice. Yeah, and then we've got rusty, which kind of does this effect where it, essentially just like almost makes it look like it's rusting away. So roughen edges is one thing. There's another one that I use a lot, and I've mentioned this in a previous tutorial, which is glow. So if I drag glow into here, you can see that it literally does exactly what it says, where we can create a glow to our text, and I can make that more intense if I wanted to. And I'm not going to mess around with the color here. We actually have to change, if we want this to be the color that we choose here, we have to change glow colors to A and B colors, and then I believe what we can do is no. Okay, that might not work. That's all right. Well, anyway, you've got glow. You've got glow that you can use. Glow is a really nice effect, depending again on what you're looking for, but it can really make your titles look interesting and definitely distinguish. Look at that. I mean, if we compare that now to our subtitle, it's completely different. Now, for me personally, this as a headline may be a bit too different. It could be a bit too different, but it still works in my opinion. It still has like nice effect to it. There's also another thing to note. Whenever you've got a title, you want to just think about how you can format your title in a way in which it just looks aesthetically pleasing. So let's just say, I'll try and give you an example. Let's just say our title was the country of France. So how would we make the country of France as a title look interesting under the context that we have? You know, this will be what France looks like. In fact, let's start afresh. Let's start afresh, okay? Let's pretend we're on a fresh canvas and our title is the country of France. I'm going to align this to the center here. Cool. The country of France. Now, you'll also notice that a lot of cinematic text is very actually small in font size. It's very small. And that tends to look more cinematic than, for example, this same text being big. And one thing I'm going to do here as well is I'm just going to head on into the paragraph window and make it centered, so that anytime I align it, it actually aligns like this as opposed to what it was doing before. Cool. So you'll notice that like this, it doesn't look as cinematic as if we just made it smaller and it looked like that. And another thing to note with cinematic text before we continue talking about, you know, how to format the title itself is they will have a lot of tracking. So, I mean, you can see now like that looks far more cinematic than what we had like here, right? So, let's just redo that. So like this is really looking cinematic. And you might even think this is like way too small, but this is exactly like cinematic text always has this thing of being really small, the tracking being really wide, and it just looks really nice. And in many cases, like with certain cinematic titles, the tracking will always be animated. So you almost imagine like the tracking will start here and it will just slowly move out like this. And you probably notice this in so many trailers where it will animate like that. And I'll show you how to do that now. We're kind of like meandering now on a completely separate thing, but it's worth going into. So I've selected the text, I've clicked animate, and let's go to tracking. We've got range selector, tracking type, tracking amount. Don't worry about any of this other stuff. We're just going to look at tracking amount. And I'm going to stopwatch here, add in a keyframe right here at the start to 0. Let's move across in our timeline. Let's go 6 seconds and let's just increase that tracking amount to something like that. I mean, look at that. I mean, that looks really cinematic. But if you press play, and you can see it does this. This is so common. So many trailers, movies, like so many things will have this tracking animation. It's very, very common. And that is a really cinematic looking text. But anyway, let's pretend, I mean, this could be a title as well, by the way. Sometimes, and what you'll notice, especially with editing, I've really noticed this, is that like you start off with like doing a bunch of fancy stuff, and the more you just continue editing, you learn to like grow a bit more of a style with what you do, and you start to notice that the less or the more subtle things are, depending again on what you're going for, but the more subtle things are, the almost better it can look. So quite frankly, you can use this as a title for a video, and it can literally just look like this. Maybe we'll we'll drag the keyframe along so that it's a little slower when it comes to the tracking, and this could work as a title. But let's say because you know, for the purpose of what we're doing now, I wanted to teach you a bit more about how to format a title or make it look interesting. Let's say we didn't have this and it was back to normal, and we'll increase the font. So what I want to do, let's say I really wanted to emphasize France, right? And I really wanted that to pop out. And then the country of is more of a smaller text. A classic thing that you can do is you can imagine that we will have the country of over at the top here centered, and France will be below it, and it will be tracked, and it will be huge, and it will kind of it will have the same width as the country of at the top. So of course, it sounds way more complicated if I'm just not showing you. So I will show you right now what I mean. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make these two separate layers. So the country of will be on this text layer, and I'm going to make a new text. I'm going to call this France. And what we can do here, let's align this to the center, the middle. I'm just going to move that up and then move that like that. And now what I can do, I'm going to make this text much thicker. Like this. And then let's increase the tracking. And there you go. There's like an interesting thing, right? We're not done. This is just one example, but this is like an interesting way of formatting this title. So we've got the country of right here, and then France is like really big, bold, centered, and it's like tracked enough. Like it's always nice to have the symmetry of having this with enough like the same width as the country of at the top. Let's actually drag it down a little because it is slightly less There we go. So like that symmetry looks really nice. Like admittedly, sometimes you can have it so this is just way more centered like this, and that still looks good. Again, like it just depends on what you think looks great for you. So both this looks good, but if you really wanted to emphasize that France, you can have it look like that, right? And that's just like an interesting way of like making your your text just look, or your titles look interesting, right? And another little bonus thing that you can do here, if it was really applicable, you can, let's pre-comp what we've got here. So the country of France, pre-comp, and what we'll do is we'll go into effects and presets, and I'm going to find 3D, where is it? I'm pretty sure it's 3D, basic 3D. There we go, that's what we're looking for. So we're going to add in basic 3D onto this composition, and if you have never used basic 3D, very simple, very self-explanatory. I've dragged it into this. You've got two options here, or two main options, swivel and tilt, and if you just play around with this, you'll notice what it does. It does this interesting thing. What you can do is you can tilt this a little bit to look like that, and it adds something, you know, something different. Again, it's a way in which you can change up your title, make it look a little more interesting. Let's just redo all of this, go back. Now let's maybe add in a texture for France. Let's add in that texture that we had used before. So I'll pull that up as an image, and I believe we create the image. So remember, track matte on our image, and we want to make it, we want the alpha matte to be France, and there we go. We have that. Maybe you want, let's play around with the actual texture and just lower the size of that. You can see what it actually does, right? You can see when I lower the size of our texture image, and if it's like below the size of the text itself, it will like cut it away. So you just want to be aware of that. Something like that. So again, that's an interesting title. Again, maybe you can, let's pre-comp France text. Just going to pre-comp the France text so that then when we apply, let's say, a glow effect, that it applies to all of that. Just go, let's increase the radius. I'm actually a big fan of this. Wait, let's make it, let's see what we can do to make it look better. Yeah, something like that. Looks a little better. There you go. And there's a title idea for you. So I think I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to cover, really, because the whole point of this tutorial is to experiment, to kind of show you what I look at when I'm like creating titles and text and whatnot. Oh, there was one example that I did pull up, is just like small ways in which you can like distinguish a subtitle from, you know, from anything really. And it was in my law of attraction video. Let's go back to it. So yeah, here in the law of attraction video, we have this little moment at the start, and I do this in a lot of like definition sections of my videos. Whenever I'm giving a definition to something, you'll see that, let's just mute the volume. So you'll see what we've got here is we've got this law of attraction text, which is like, look at the ways in which I've tried to distinguish each part of this definition from each other. So you've got law of attraction here, which is italics. It's in italics and it's white and it has a very soft glow to it. So I was thinking of maybe I should recreate in After Effects, but I'll first explain everything here first. So it's italics, it's got a soft glow to it and it's white. The thing at the top here to explain like what kind of branch of belief it's from, which is New Thought, you've got New Thought in grey, which is positioned in the top left of the Law of Attraction text, but you've also got like these two dashes that I added in. It just makes it look interesting. You can literally do the exact same thing. You know, you can literally, or instead of the dashes, you could literally just put it right to the left side of that Law of Attraction text over here, and it would look the same, but I just thought adding in dashes maybe looks a little nicer. And then the actual definition itself over here is, I think I've made it like slightly grayish, and I think it's still the same font, but it's just been grayed out a little and obviously smaller font. And you can see like those three things combined make this definition look really nice because they're very they're distinguished from each other. So yeah, I think that basically covers a lot of the stuff that I wanted to in this video. If you do have any other questions, let me know in the comments as always. But I wanted this, I've been trying to get like a text tutorial done for a while, and I really wanted to get something where I just kind of mess around with some titles and show you some interesting stuff that I create, or the way in which I think of when I try and create titles, and show you the different ways in which you can experiment and actually make your titles look good, because a lot of people have horrible titles. So remember, font is important, distinguishing areas of your titles is important. Use the website font pair to know which fonts go with what. Yeah, I think that covers it all. And that concludes this video editing tutorial. Thank you, all of you, for watching. I hope it was helpful. As I said, it's a little bit different to maybe how my other tutorials are on the Patreon, but I thought that it might be interesting just hearing my thought processes as like a kind of workshop different ideas on After Effects right in front of you. So yeah, let me know how that was. But other than that, I hope it was really helpful. Thank you, as always, for supporting me and for watching these tutorials. If you have any more suggestions, comment them down below, as always. But yeah, with that being said, my friends, I wish you the best rest of the day. As always, hand to head, salute.